Okay, I think we're probably still waiting for a couple of people, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just going to do some sort of housekeeping things right off the top. We learned over the last 5 minutes that if you want my video to be like big, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But if you would like that, you have to pin my video, which you do by sort of hovering your mouse over the like my Zoom box and pressing the three little dots, and then there'll be an option for pin, and then you'll mostly just see me. But do whatever you like. Also, we have a live transcript option if you would like to have like closed captioning. It's sort of at the bottom of the screen, just to the right of the record button. And to use it, you have to press the little arrow that's pointing like up in the corner of that button, and you can choose to put subtitles on. And they're kind of like okay. Like Otter does like a pretty good job of transcribing things, but it's not perfect. So if you're using those and as we're going, there's something kind of that makes literally no sense, and even as I keep talking, like further context isn't making it make any more sense, feel free to just message me in the chat and I can clarify things. We are recording this so that people who can't be here or who have to leave early or who might want to look at it in the future can see it. So just to be aware, if you don't feel like being on the recording, just go ahead and turn your camera off. This workshop is mostly going to be me talking. There will be sort of a couple moments where we can chat with each other and answer questions and that kind of thing. But for the most part, it's going to be like fairly information intensive. So I would just ask, and I think everybody's done this already, but if you wouldn't mind just turning off your mic unless we're talking, that'll keep the quality of the audio as high as possible for everyone. And this being a sound design workshop, I think that would be nice. What other housekeeping things do I have to say? I'm going to be sort of giving pretty prosaic, like not super detailed, but sort of yeah, simple visual descriptions of what's happening on screen when I'm screen sharing, so that if you're doing your dishes while you're listening to this, or you're out for a run, or just like engaging with screens is not a fun time for you, you will still be able to follow what's going on. Yes, this is going to be released later, just as a recording, and also I'll release the transcript of it if you like to engage with written material. So if you want today to be taking notes, of course, by all means do. If you'd rather just sort of experience things and then revisit material later on, you're free to do that as well. I'm gonna all the material I'm gonna share today. We're gonna look at like some shows, some clips from some shows. But all the material I'm gonna share today, I've tried to keep really like G-rated. There's a couple points where I'll sort of offer a content warning before showing something, but for the most part, I think everything's gonna be okay. That being said, I know that like for me, there's just like certain days where engaging with certain topics is just like off the table. I don't want to do it. And I think one of the things that's really great about Zoom, there's so many things that are horrible about it, but one of the things that's great about doing things over Zoom is that like you can really leave whenever you want. And I think that in theater or performance especially, we have so much like baggage around like needing to stay in the space and like feeling a lot of shame if we leave. So I'd encourage you, at any time, for any reason, if you want to dip out, you can. This material will be available later. There's no test at the end of this. So if you miss something, whatever. Yeah, I'd really just encourage you to engage with this material however you like, in whatever way works for you. And yeah. So I think I know almost everybody, but maybe not quite everybody. I'm Davis. My pronouns are she or they. I'm a white trans feminine person. I have sort of long, dirty blonde hair, about like shoulder length, and some very big pink glasses and a septum piercing. I'm wearing like a peachy pink turtleneck and some green eyeshadow and some winged eyeliner. I'm descended from Scottish, German, and Mennonite settlers, and I think some people are joining from different places, but I'm like broadcasting this workshop today from Treaty 1 territory, which is the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Something that I feel like I'm hearing more and more Indigenous activists and artists talk about is sort of the way in which these, land acknowledgements that so many of us have kind of memorized and say before our events and our little gatherings, like they do some things while not doing other things, and especially when they're done by, settlers and settler colonial organizations, they can sort of be a really easy out, a really sort of easy way to like say something and not actually do anything that will result in change. Just sort of be like, oh yes, colonialism, it's here, and move on. And I feel like what I'm hearing people say more and more is that we really have to rethink this paradigm and need to move towards a much more like action-oriented way of approaching things, and that we've seen so much like symbolic justice happen and so little real justice happen, so little material change, so much symbolic change. And I think like we're all connected to the performing arts in some way, and like the performing arts is really like the epicenter of like saying things without doing anything. You know, not to be mean, but that's like basically what a play is. So I think that we really have a lot of work to do, and we need to start working a hell of a lot harder than we have been to start moving towards really material, tangible change. So today we're going to talk about how to communicate with sound designers. This is sort of generally for like directors and choreographers, but I know not everybody here is coming from that background. That's going to be kind of like who I'm pitching this to, I suppose, but my hope is that really wherever you're coming from, you'll find something useful. So we're going to talk about what a sound designer is, some ways of communicating with the sound designer, and some examples of like what sound design can do. We'll take a short break and we can chat a little bit then if you like. And then in the last bit of the workshop, I'll just sort of go through step by step, sort of like how I would build a sound cue, and maybe just demystify that process a little bit if you haven't been looking over a sound designer's shoulder before. And then I'll just talk a little bit about sort of collaborating with sound designers and some of the things that are sort of unique about that collaboration. I want to emphasize that like this is not a step-by-step silver bullet, take this workshop, you'll have beautiful sound designs the rest of your career kind of a workshop. I feel like in the theater industry there are a lot of those kinds of classes, take this and this really isn't going to be one of those workshops. Really, my goal is just to offer you some information about sound designers and our process that isn't shared, publicly very often, and to offer some tools to you that might be useful as you explore ways of thinking and communicating about sound design that work for you. So I thought a good place to start would just be talking about like what a sound designer is, or what sound design is. And right away, things get very interesting and confusing. So if we look to the ADC, which is the Associated Designers of Canada, they're basically like the designers union here. we find the following definition of sound design. Okay, so in their literature, they say, sound design includes, but is not limited to, the selection of the location, orientation, type, and quality of electronically reproduced and/or enhanced sound to be used in the production, and the placement and duration of all sound cues and aural effects to be used in the production. Which basically translates to sound design is like speakers, microphones, sound effects, cicadas on page 3, door slam, page 5. However, right below this, there's a note which says, note, frequently, producers anticipate sound designers to serve as composers. This should be discussed and agreed to in advance by all parties as it affects the equipment, time, and skills required of the sound designer. So even within sort of like the closest thing to like a legal body governing like what this job is, there's like this split. Sound design is both sort of like pure sound design, this sort of technical job involving sort of speaker placement, miking actors and performers, getting and programming sound effects. And on the other hand, there's sort of this like more music or composition oriented thing where sound design is like writing songs or musical sound cues or this kind of thing. And I found that like IRL, especially at like a more indie level where you probably only have money to buy like, or to hire one person to do like all your sound, cover all your sound needs. Sound design like functionally includes some music direction to, whether that's just sort of like the director wants, this actor who plays guitar to play and sing a little song, or, we want some oohs and ahs from the chorus in Act 3, or, this kind of thing. So for the purposes of this workshop, although, sort of pure sound design, composition or music, and dealing with live music, although those are all sort of like fully fledged jobs of their own right, when I say sound design in this workshop, I'm sort of using that phrase as I've sort of found it used most, which is to say it means all three. So on top of right away this kind of confusion about what sound design even is in the first place and what a sound designer should do, there's really no standardized training or practice for sound designers. Like pretty much all of us start in other fields and then find our way to theater in like really roundabout ways. Like no kid grows up being like, I want to be a sound designer for the theater when I grow up, in the same way that, I think like especially performers, that's like a much more common experience. And so like our backgrounds and the other work we've done and the other work we might be doing alongside sound design, because many of us don't do it full time, really, really influences our skill sets and approaches to design. So like, just to like use myself as an example, like I took a bunch of guitar lessons when I was a kid. I played in some bands. I learned like a fair bit about music theory. I taught myself how to like make sounds on my computer by watching YouTube. And then when I started working as a sound designer, like I've done a lot of work as a composer. I've done some work as like a pure sound designer. I've done some work, a little bit of work with music direction. And I've mostly worked on like indie scale dance and theater shows, and sort of a mix of like really traditional processes and like more collaborative, process-driven sort of ways of working. On top of this, I have like a weird background in like literature and cultural studies, which I think like really informs how I like approach reading play text. And I'm also trans, which means I have this like weirdo, a lot of weird feelings about like bodies, which really, really influences how I interact with dancers and choreographers and more movement-based practices. So I feel like every sound designer's sort of backstory, origin story is like this weird and all over the place and varied. And we all have different strengths and different weaknesses. And I think the other thing that sort of makes this question of like, how do we communicate with sound designers a little bit confusing for a lot of people is that like sound design shows up and doesn't show up in our daily lives in really weird ways. You know, like on the one hand, we're like surrounded by it. Like every time we play a video game or watch a movie or watch a TV show or like watch a TikTok, like I'd actually really encourage everyone to watch TikToks if you want to learn about sound design. Like those kids know what sound design is and how it works. And how to use it for telling stories. You know, every time you get in a car, when there's sort of like those little beeps and boops when you like open and close the door and turn things on and off, like those were made by a sound designer. I recently learned that there's actually like sort of a huge subset of the automotive industry devoted to sound design. Uh, who knew? But all to say, we're sort of surrounded by it. And yet, on the other hand, the sort of tools that are involved in most sound designers' work, we aren't as in touch with as, say, we are with the basic tools of other design fields. So, you know, we've all turned lights on and off, not to disparage the lighting designers, but that's lighting design. You know, we get dressed in the morning, we rearrange our bedroom, we have costume design, we have set design, homes are full of objects we got at the thrift store. You know, that's prop design. Like those sort of like really fundamental tasks that are done by designers in other fields, we sort of encounter in our everyday lives. But I think that the tools of sound design and like the language of sound design have been really, unfortunately, like successfully gatekept by music and sound engineering schools and communities that basically say, you know, the only way you can know something about sound or about music is if you, you know, pay us or hang out with us or think we're cool or whatever. You sort of have to go through us to get there. And if you don't, you just sort of don't know what you're talking about. And I think like, you know, whether it's through like music classes or you know, local music scenes or competitive band programs or whatever, like I think a lot of us have been exposed to this really toxic way of thinking about things, really like from really young. And I know that for me, in many ways, it's really affected my relationship to sound. And mostly what it's done is it's alienated me from like my instinctive responses to sound. I feel like those instincts don't really count because I feel shame about the things I don't know. And I can't sort of help but wonder if the really amazing like enthusiasm that has been shown for this workshop, where we sort of have a chance to talk about how we talk about sound design, might mean that lots of other people have had a similar experience as well. I don't know, but I'm just guessing. So all to say, when we are communicating about sound design, this is like the messy situation we have. We don't know what sound design is, we're scared to talk about it, and every sound designer is like an alien from a different planet. Um, and so what this means is that, you know, just as there's no universal sound designer, there's no sort of universal vocabulary or way of communicating with a sound designer that's going to work. So every collaboration you have with a sound designer, you know, really needs needs unique time and energy and needs to be approached as its own thing, as a, you know, relationship that's going to be different than relationships you have with other sound designers. That being said, in my experience, there are some, you know, helpful things you can do. So here's the main thing. I feel like this is like the big point of the workshop. You don't need to be technical, but you do need to be specific. So I think that this sort of can show up in a lot of different ways. You know, one way that you're going to need to be specific is, you know, figuring out what kind of sound designer you need for your project. You know, maybe it's a really complicated show where there's a lot of speakers and speaker placement, a lot of miking, and then there's like original music that needs to be scored and recorded, and then there's also like some live singing. You know, maybe you're going to end up needing to hire more than one person to sort of get the skill sets in the room you need to accomplish all of those things. And And I think that this often doesn't happen because, in my experience, sound design is often left sort of for the very end of the pre-production process. In my experience, it's the last line on the budget. It's the last person. You figure out, who's going to be your sound designer for your show. Producers do this, directors do this. But I think that the communication complexities of working with a sound designer are significant enough that I feel like it should be the other way around. Like you should be thinking about sound quite early in the process and about who you might want to work with and what sort of skill sets they might need to have. Um, and start talking to people about like what they can and what they can't do. Like if you approached me and were like, "Hey Davis, what can you do?" I could be like, "Well, I can write you stuff. I can write music really well. I can like do some live miking, some speaker placement. Like we have a little DIY venue and we need a PA rented and brought in. I got you covered." And if there's a band or like a good a guitarist or something that I need to talk to about playing some live music, I can totally do that. But I'm not great at working with singers, so if you want to bring in a choir and act for, I can't help you. And if you want a realistic 18th century style string quartet written, I also can't help you. If you need to mic a musical, I also can't help you. And I think starting to learn these things about your potential collaborators early on is really important, because otherwise we wind up in this situation where we sort of both discover, partway through the process that there's these things that you wanted done or that need to be done that I might not be equipped to do. And that's just going to, frustrate both of us and make the process more difficult. Okay, so we could sort of imagine a little hypothetical scenario. You're a choreographer, you're a director, you found a sound designer, you signed the dotted line, you're going to work with somebody. Congratulations, that's so great. So now, whoever you've hired, whatever their skill set might be, whatever the demands of your show are, you now need to sort of, get into the work of collaboration and talk to them about, their ideas and your ideas and what's needed. And what the project needs. And I think I feel like I've noticed like the most fear in talking with directors and choreographers when it sort of comes to this point where we're sort of like actually talking about, so what's the sound going to be like for the show? And I feel like a lot of people are like, I don't know. And I think that actually a lot of the time people do know, but sort of are lost for like language to use to articulate what they might be interested in. And so I found that sort of my best experiences with directors and choreographers haven't been with audio nerds who like know all the technical language and sort of like ask for like exactly what they want in kind of a surgical way. It's actually been with people who talk to me about sound design in terms of things they already know a lot about. Again, you don't have to be technical, you just have to be specific. So some things that directors have done with me that I found really, really helpful have been like making me a playlist. Like a director like Francis Conkin is really, really good at this. Like their writing process and sort of just the way they think about art is so informed by music. And when I've worked with them and they've made me a playlist of like, here's stuff I was listening to when I was working on the show, or this is just sort of like the vibe of things, that's actually given me fantastic information. Not necessarily, to be like, oh, we need to make some music that sounds exactly like this, but it sort of gets me into the emotional terrain of what's happening. And, maybe we notice things like, every song on this playlist is really, really fast. Maybe the music should be fast, even if it's a different genre, completely different sonic textures and whatever. We can, I found that I can often get a lot of information just from a playlist of things that, the creator's been thinking about. Something else that can be good, I think, is to talk about movies. Unless we've both gone to see the same show, and also both remember it pretty well, it can sometimes be a little hard to talk about sound design like really concretely and to give like concrete examples of things that you want or that excite you. But with films, they include basically all the elements of sound design, and they can sort of be a nice like concrete thing to be like, I love the sound design of A Quiet Place. Dear sound designer, please go watch it, and then we can talk about what's so great about it, and maybe that can sort of help get the ball rolling for our process. I also really like it. I feel like not every sound designer would like this, but I really like it when directors talk to me in metaphors. So I was once asked to create some sound for a piece where the sound was supposed to be inspired by an octopus. So I looked up what an octopus sounds like, and it just sort of sounds like chirp, chirp, chirp. Like it doesn't make much sound, and I really didn't feel like what the director wanted was like chirp, chirp, chirp. Like what she wanted was like something that sounds like the feeling of an octopus, crawling across the ocean floor and like being squishy and mysterious and like having a lot of tendrils. That remains to this day like one of the favorite sound designs I've ever done. And I think it was partly just because there was like so much creative freedom, but also specificity in that direction. Something that's really special about sound, as we all know, is that the environment or space that you're in really affects the way, affects like what sound sounds like. So I think talking about like environments and spaces can be really, really useful. And again, it can be abstract. You don't need to be super literal about things. Like I once worked on a show where a lot of the show took place in the afterlife, which was represented by this sort of cloud that like all of the audience and the performers were inside of. And so we talked a lot about like what's a cloud sound like? Like, okay, there's like little, there's like rain particles sort of floating around and bumping into each other, and then there's sort of like ice crystals like, sort of hitting against each other and making little metallic sounds, I guess. And then, there's sort of like thunder and lightning. It's just in the wings. It could happen at any time, sort of this like looming presence. It's like there, but it's not like happening yet. Like, even just sort of thinking about like what would a cloud sound like, even though I've never been in one. I mean, except in a plane, I guess. You can't really hear like what a cloud really sounds like, but you can imagine it. And that was like super useful imagery for us in thinking about that show. Talk in terms of like texture and shape, like rough, fast, sharp, angular, slow, curved, rounded, jagged, whatever. Like all of that language, I think, is really useful for sound designers, can totally be translated into, sound. Yeah, can be useful. Like just talk about sound like you were talking about like a kindergarten class's, Play-Doh project, like shapes, textures, colors, lines, angles. If you are sort of like a more conceptually minded person, I feel like this is probably especially pertinent to the dance folks in the room. Don't be afraid to sort of talk about with your sound designer like what the sound represents in the piece. I worked on a show a while ago where it was a show about like a sort of this like, it was a dance show, it was a solo dance show about this sort of very vain conductor, and it was inspired by a historical figure. And we decided after a lot of back and forth that like the sound design should sort of represent like the way that he saw the world, sort of like his interior sense of what the world was, that it was very melodramatic, it was very romantic, and he was always at the very center of it, sort of controlling things. Again, that's kind of like abstract, but it was totally useful in thinking about what we wanted to do for the sound. On that same project, we talked a lot about sound sources. I think this can be another kind of more like abstract, like brainy way of approaching sound if you're into that. So we talked a lot about sort of like where we were getting sounds from, what like archive or like sample bank or palette, whatever language you prefer, of sounds we were going to use. And what we decided for that project is that we found out that I had a bunch of old classical music recordings that this historical figure the piece was inspired by had conducted. And so we ended up making the whole sound design sort of out of like bits and pieces of those recordings. We digitized them and then sort of cut them and mashed them together, and made the sound design out of that. And that was like I think like a really cool and special way to sort of like tie everything together in a way that like kind of was just secret for us, but I think was also like felt through the project. So that can be a fun thing to do. When in doubt, your sound designers are people too. So talk to them like you would talk to an actor. You're trying to describe to an actor or a performer, what's happening emotionally, what the stakes are in the scene, what they're feeling, what kind of mindset they're in, what's going on in the story, all of that language, like whatever tools you use to talk to actors, I think you can just like one-to-one import and use, or to talk to performers, just like talk to your sound designers like that. That can give them a really, really good emotional and narrative in to sort of how you're thinking about the story or the performance. And I think can work really well. So, those are some examples. I think this thing about communicating with sound designers, like, I think there's like a million ways to do it. And it really is about sort of finding what works for you. And, all you really have to do when you're working with a sound designer is like find a way of talking about things that make sense to both of you. Like, all you have to do is communicate. You don't need to communicate one way or another. You don't need to know some special language. You just sort of have to talk to each other in a way that's going to make sense for both of you. And I think that the odds are, hopefully your sound designer is going to be, quite actively engaged in this process of like figuring out how you're going to communicate at the same time as you are. I found that like, I don't know, like 70% of the job of sound design when I do it is actually just, especially working with a new person, is just figuring out like how are we going to talk to each other so that we're on the same page, so that I'm making something that like is actually useful for the project. So this can be, a real project in mutual understanding. I don't think it needs to sort of fall all on the sound designer or on the creative lead of a project. And I found that sometimes it takes a bit of experimenting to find out what will work for both of you. And I think that, even if there isn't like a magical solution for thinking about how to communicate about sound, what's magical is like figuring out together what will work for you, building like a language, whatever that's made up of, between the two of you that will let you communicate. And I think that you'll probably communicate way more accurately than, some standardized blah, blah, blah that someone tells you should talk to sound designers with, if you just sort of really invest in that relationship and in that mutual understanding. Okay, so the point of all that is just to say you probably know a lot more about talking to sound designers than you think you do. And have fun, try different things. Find something that works for you and your sound designer. I know you can do it. So what I thought we would do next is, we've sort of talked about some different sort of subsets of sound design. And I wanted to just share some clips of some shows that I think feature really exciting sound design and kind of like just kind of show off like what can be done with each of those different sort of subsets of sound design. So I'm going to share my screen. If this doesn't work, can somebody just like message me. No one's messaging me yet, so I'm gonna go ahead and assume that worked okay. So the first show we're going to look at is a show called K Body and Mind, which was made by a Vancouver collective called Awake of Vultures, and one of their members is a sound designer and composer, Nancy Tam. She did all the sound design for the piece, and I just have so much respect for her. I think she's fantastic. Something to know just before we watch this short trailer clip is that there was basically no sets for the performance. The costumes never changed. They were extremely minimalistic. The performances were really like abstract. A lot of it was sort of like mimed, like there wasn't a lot of like action in the way we might recognize it in the theater. And I think it was really the sound design, sort of pure sound design, like sound effects, really creative miking, this kind of thing, that really communicated a lot about like a sense of location, time passing, action, narrative, that kind of thing. So let's just watch a couple clips from this. And again, if people can't hear...
Eyes ahead, no look back, seat, wind, hand in hand. Let go of me!
Could people hear that okay? Yeah, okay, great. Let's look at another one. Let's try re-screen sharing that. There we go. Okay, and this is another just short trailer.
Up there! Dr. Iskandar, stop! Damn, how is she doing that?
Go, the fire escape!
Stop! Holy shit, she just smashed through a wall.
Go inside. Ah! Mommy!
Excuse me.
Out!
Sorry, security, watch out, sorry.
So you can see, I think, even in those two short clips, the sound design is really communicating like our sense of atmosphere and tone. The sound design was like super closely tied to like the lighting effects that were happening. And there was like a really, beautiful integration of different design disciplines happening. And sound was doing a lot of the storytelling work. And just sort of as a side note, one of the reasons for this is that they really wanted the performance to be accessible to blind and low vision folks. And so they got a blind consultant to come into rehearsals and sort of just sit and listen to what was happening and would ask her, you know, like, is the story making sense to you? What do you think is happening right now? Because, you know, it being in the sci-fi genre, it's like a lot going on. There's a lot of like detail and facts and information and sci-fi stuff. So I think that really helped that piece be very successful in terms of what the sound design was communicating. Let's look at another example of sort of like pure sound design. This is from a piece called Give Me a Fucking Break, which is by a Montreal performance artist named Guillaume Bibi. It was sound designed by Sami Halimi, and this piece is kind of special because it's the like everything that I'm showing here is like publicly available on people's Vimos and whatever, except for this one, which I watched online at a festival like a week before this workshop, and was like, oh my god, there's so much good sound design in this. I need to show it. And I messaged her, and she agreed to let me share some clips, which is very exciting. Thank you, Guillaume. So this is a piece called Give Me a Fucking Break, and what I just want you to listen for in this piece is the way that like miking a performer allows you to do some really wild things with an actor's voice. We'll watch right from the beginning. Hey. Hi. Sorry, one second. This isn't the right bit.
I made a simple.
Okay, sorry about that. Here we go. Just listen to what happens when the performer gets on the mic. Okay, cool. So even in that short clip, what we can kind of see happening is when the performer is mic'd, their voice can be processed and it can be affected, you know, in the same way you might plug a guitar into an amplifier or some pedals and it, you know, totally changes the sound of the guitar. That sort of same kind of thing can be done to a performer's voice. And I think this is like a great example of pure sound design. You know, the microphone is letting the performer in this piece sort of like, it kind of feels like their voice kind of gets like stretched out somehow, like it starts to kind of layer up with itself. It sort of has this like really like gravelly, scary tone to it. It's like lower than, you know, the performer would be able to reach just like on their own. You know, in this show, which is about vampires, I think it works very, very well. So another cool example of like pure sound design, you know, speakers, microphones, sound effects at play there. And of course, some beautiful composition and music at the same time. So let's look at one more example of sort of like pure sound design. So this is a piece called Cuckoo by a and I think I'm probably saying his name wrong, an artist named Yaha Ku, with some assistance on the sound design element I'll show you from Adela Craddock. And what's really special about this piece is just sort of how creatively it thinks about like the speaker in live theater. Like I think we're really used to this idea that like sound that's amplified is gonna come through a speaker that's sort of hidden away. You know, we won't really see it. It's going to be hidden in the wings or, you know, flown up in the fly house or whatever. And I think this piece just sort of really gets like right in there and really asks like what happens if we like really mess around with how an audience is going to hear hear sounds. Just a content warning for this piece, it doesn't like get super into it, but it sort of relates a story that takes place during the Japanese colonization of Korea.
나의 할아버지는 오차즈케를 좋아하셨어. 할아버지가 젊으셨을 때 조선에서 도묵점을 하던 일본인의 모습이었는데 일본인들이 먹는 음식을 부러워하셨던 것 같아. 나중에 돈을 모아서 머슴살이를 그만두고 방앗간을 차리셨는데 아침마다 우메보시에 오차즈케를 드셨대. 그런데 어느 날 할머니가 녹차물에 밥을 말아서 법선굴비를 아침으로 내놓으신 거야. 그랬더니 할아버지는 밥상을 엎으면서 노발대발 화를 내시고 일본말로 라고 말씀하시곤 나가버리신 거야.
So this piece is just, it's so magical to me. Basically what the artist did is like hacked this very sort of popular Korean brand of rice maker, and had 3 of them on stage with him. And at different points, they would like talk, they would tell little stories in their sort of little automated rice cooker voice, but obviously like saying a lot more than the rice cooker was originally able to say by itself. And there was like something so amazing and intimate about like hearing sound come from an everyday object that was just like in the space with us, and yet had been magically transformed. Like if these had been on stage and the lights were just going on and off and like the sound had been coming through a speaker, I just don't think it would have been the same. There was something so amazing about sound emanating from these, you know, really everyday objects that just sort of had become totally transformed and magical. So those are a few different examples of sort of like pure sound design and like cool things you can do with it. If you're working with someone who has that skill set, and if that's something that you're interested in exploring in your project or your process. So now I sort of want to move to talking about like the sort of composing or like use of music side of sound design. And we're going to start by watching a trailer, and it's a trailer, unfortunately not a clip, but a trailer from a show called This American Wife, which was created by fake friends who produced that Ratatouille musical that happened earlier in the pandemic. If any of you got that, it was very delightful, the Ratatouille TikTok musical. But they just recently made this show, and I think this is sort of like a show that is a really cool example of how you might use like canned music, like music that already exists out in the world. Your sound designer doesn't have to compose it. They maybe need to alter it a bit, but it already exists out in the world, and they're doing something creative with it. So let's just watch this trailer, and then we'll talk about it.
Hey, Patrick.
I want to kill myself.
Patrick, don't say that. It's not appropriate. Jakeem, you look amazing, sweetie. Okay, Patrick, tell me what This American Wife is about.
Oh my god, Michael, stop. This American Wife is a really personal play about my obsession with the Real Housewives.
Patrick, it's not about your obsession, it's about our obsession. This American Wife is a 90-minute probably play about the Real Housewives, global consumerism, and the urge to humiliate yourself on camera.
Come see This American Wife, where Michael, Jakeem, and I will bring taunt theater and postmodern performance to the internet where it's never been.
Because you look so beautiful.
I'm doing a photo shoot right now, you're interrupting it.
Okay, so that was very fun. So something this show does that is totally, I've kind of never seen anything quite like it before. Through that 90-minute production, almost for the whole thing, it's underscored by reality TV music. Like just those super generic little songs that play in the background of reality TV and kind of are like, kind of vaguely gesture towards like, this is a conflict scene, this is a happy scene, this is a traffic scene, or this is just a scene that needs some background music. And the show uses the audio vocabulary of reality TV really successfully, I think, to take us as viewers into sort of the genre of the piece, and to sort of like brings in all these emotional associations we already have with that style of sound. And I think what's so brilliant about this trailer is that the trailer actually like uses the audio vocabulary of reality TV show promos. Like it's this sort of like little upbeat jingle that like they definitely didn't make. That was stolen from the internet somewhere. Like that is like a stock little audio recording that arguably isn't very creative, but is being used so creatively because it's bringing with it all of these associations that then the performers and the creators can be playing with. And that's really like what canned music does best, is that it brings a lot of expectations and associations with it just by, playing it for an audience in a way that originally composed music probably isn't going to do because the audience hasn't heard it before and hasn't actually made those emotional associations yet. So I think that's like what's really exciting about canned music. I do just sort of want to note super quickly that there's like a sort of ongoing and complicated conversation about like music rights and canned music. There's sort of not a lot of agreement necessarily on like the ethics of it, like when it's okay to do it with or without asking, and with or without getting the rights to it. But I do just sort of want to note that like wherever you sort of stand on the ethical conversation of it, if you're directing or choreographing, doing choreography for like a larger institution, the producers are definitely going to want to get rights to any music that you might want to use that is, you know, not original. And that just takes time and money. It can totally be done. But it's something to think about actually very early in the process, and not, you know, don't wait till like the very end of like tech to figure out, you know, what song should play during the dance party at the end of the play. Like figure that out right at the beginning. Okay, let's look at another show. This show I think is a pretty cool example of what you can do with sound design if you have if you're working with a composer. So this is just a short bit of a piece called "Fury of My Thoughts" by Marie Broussard. And this project had a sound team. There was a sound designer, Frederick Auger, who I'm guessing, sort of based on watching it, probably was mostly responsible for miking the performers. It's kind of a complicated setup. And music and composition by Alexander McSween. So we're just going to sort of look at a section where the play transitions from a monologue that one of the performers is giving to a song.
Jusque dans la laideur et dans ce qu'on n'arrive pas à dire. Jusqu'à ne plus supporter d'être soi-même et s'endormir.
Je suis beaucoup plus intéressante la nuit.
La nuit,
Le sommeil me rend presque jolie. Jolie.
presque jolie.
Je fais des rêves à grand déploiement.
Je fais des rêves.
La nuit, de tempête et d'orage.
So again, just a short clip, but so we can see some really exciting things happening here. So, you know, this clip began just with a monologue that was sort of underscored by some fairly neutral composition. Although, you know, the performers' lines somehow sort of like really, I don't quite know how they did this. Like somehow all the lines in this show just felt like they were like mapped to the sound design and the composition. But we sort of have this underscoring that then sort of grows and transforms into this original song that is sort of being sung by the whole cast. You know, their backs are to us. We can't even really tell who's singing all the time, but we can hear sometimes voices together, sometimes apart, sometimes speaking, sometimes singing. And I think that this sort of very like complicated sound design, you know, you can't really do it if you're using canned music. You really need to be working with a composer to make something like this happen. And I think that that's one of the things that like a sound designer with compositional skills can really help do, is like create continuity through moments. You know, they can sort of create a beautiful seamless transition from a monologue to a song, to a scene transition to another monologue, to silence, to whatever, to whatever, to whatever. You know, while canned music comes with like really, really specific associations, and that's kind of like the thing it's really good at, original music doesn't, which means that like you actually are sort of creating for an audience their associations with these sounds, like in real time. Like, you know, like that sort of feeling where you like can remember where you like first heard a song you really like now. Like, it's like that. It's like you're there for that moment. And I think that that's like so special and so cool, and like to create emotional associations for an audience, like that's a real privilege, and I think a really special thing about working with original sound. I mean, something else that's so great about this show is the way that like the whole show kind of like uses a really similar sound palette, like a really similar set of sounds in the composition. There's like a real continuity, like we aren't feeling like we're sort of jumping genres, or like different things have a really different tone. Like they sort of feel like they're all of a piece. And I think that that's something that working with a composer can really let you do. You know, you can build up a collection of sounds, you can build up a sonic vocabulary that you're going to use throughout the whole show, and create some really beautiful through lines in that way. Okay, let's look at one more piece that sort of is about like composition and music. So this is just a short excerpt from an adaptation of The Seagull. I think the adaptation is called I Wish You Were Here, or something like that. It's by a New York company called Half Straddle, and the sound design is by Chris Guillermo. And we're just gonna watch a transition from like a scene through the transition to the start of the next scene, and just check out the way that sound design is used in this transition. I'm sure everybody's like, it's right there, Davis. Yeah. The acting's really fun too.
Doing what?
You're an acting nerd.
Sitting around, acting like you were like acting, like channeling pleasure or something. What are you going to do about it? I think you might be looking at it.
I love that so much. So what I think is really special about kind of all of Half Straddle's work is they like elevate the transition, which, you know, in performance is kind of usually this kind of like necessary evil. It's like the table has to get on, the chairs need to get off. Can we get it over as fast as possible so we can get back to the story? And can the sound designer just make something to sort of cover it up? But they really sort of elevate the transition to like, I mean, this transition's longer than a lot of the scene. It's like literally all that happens is 3 chairs come on. It didn't need to take that long. But at the same time it did, because they treated this transition with as much care as any of like the dialogue-driven or text-driven or movement-driven parts of the performance. And I think this is just, you know, such a great example of how, if you want to approach like transitions in that way, working with someone who can compose you music is super useful, because you can sort of make something that's just the right length, that sort of just, you know, tells whatever story needs to be told in exactly the right amount of time and covers things. And, you know, if you're using canned music, you know, you find a song that sort of fits and, you know, it's playing and then the transition ends and it just fades out. It's like a deflated balloon. But if you're working with someone who can compose things, they can just sort of create something that, you know, buttons just perfectly, and can allow for transitions to be these incredibly dynamic, beautiful scenes instead of these necessary evils where we just sort of sit and pretend it didn't happen. Okay, so those are some examples of cool things you can do with music, with composers, with canned music. Let's look at an example of what you can do with like sort of the live music aspect of sound design. So this is, I haven't actually seen this piece. I've seen other performances by, or another performance by this artist, but not this one, but this is a piece called Efectos by Rocio Molina, and has live music by Rosario La Tremendita and Pablo Martin. I just sort of want you to watch for like how the musicians are so thoroughly integrated into the performance. So again, that's just a short clip, but I think one of the things that's clear even in that short bit is the way that, like, for Rocio Molina, live music isn't like a gag or a novelty, which I think is often what it becomes in live performance. It's sort of like, you know, come see our show, that there's also a live band, and then they just sort of stand there, or, you know, are in an orchestra pit, and we don't really see them or interact with them at all. But in her work, the performers are totally integrated into the choreography, and she as a dancer is integrated into the soundscapes. There's this really symbiotic relationship. And I don't think this clip sort of showed it, but she's wearing like flamenco shoes, and there's like a lot of like flamenco, that's sort of like the tradition that she's working out of. And so the sound of those shoes, the rhythms of those shoes just gets like blended with the music in the most amazing way. And what we sort of have with this live music is like an incredibly visually and sonically collaborative relationship. The band isn't just a cool feature, they're an essential part of the show. And I think that's, I mean, I really wish that I saw that more in that sort of approach more in live performance. So we could talk more about cool live things you could do with live musicians. But I sort of want to introduce a new idea here, and this is like really, really helped me as a sound designer in my approach to thinking about sound. Okay, so you know how like in performance, like all lighting that happens on stage is lighting design, right? And like all objects on stage, that's like all prop design, right? I think that's how we should think about sound. All sound on stage is sound design. I don't care where it's coming from. I don't care who made it. It's all, I think as far as you as a director or a choreographer should be concerned, it's all sound design. It's all sort of part of the sonic world that you're creating for a play. And when we start thinking this way, what you can do with sound in a show really starts to open up and be something that you as a director or a choreographer can have a much more active hand in helping to create, and it opens up some really cool and useful sound design possibilities. So let's look at a couple examples of like live sound with that sort of slightly different definition or expanded definition. So let's watch a clip from this piece called Cutlass Spring, which is by Dana Michelle, and I think she actually made the sound design, but there was a sound consultant, David Drury, and I think this is just like such an amazing piece that shows like how much experience we have with sound design when we start thinking about it as like every sound that happens on stage. Let me start a tiny bit in. Okay, great, I'll stop there. But like, oh my God, like all the objects in this dance piece are so like sonically rich. Like when she throws the ice across the floor and then is like, you know, pushing it into other things that are, you know, part of the piece. The sort of plastic lawn chairs or deck chairs that sort of get piled up in like a muddle, and then she's like crawling through them. The telephone that sort of gets tossed across the floor. All of those create this incredibly rich sound design that kind of doesn't need a lot extra, but because she's like a genius, there is this sort of more, you know, recognizably sound design component running through things of this track of mostly just her voice, vocalizing. And then she has a microphone on stage, which she also was vocalizing with. So I think this is just such a great example of like how much experience all of us actually do have with sound design. You know, we know what an ice cube falling on the floor sounds like, and why couldn't that be sound design? And it's just such an incredible performance. We'll look at another piece that sort of does this in a really special way. This is a performance called This Time Will Be Different, with sound. It's got a big sound team, sound recording and conception by Laura Kramer and Emily Manette, who also made the show, with participation of Stefan Qlab and Travis West, and organ performance by Stefan Christoph, and sound spatialization and technical design by Frederick Auger. I just have a very, very short clip of this piece, but just to sort of give a content warning for it, it is sort of about like the failure of the Canadian government to do anything about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the clip we'll watch, we'll just see some pages from the commission sort of splattered with red paint. And again, it's just a very short clip, but I would like to share it. I really wish I had a longer clip from that piece to share. But even in that short clip, there's a couple really amazing things happening with sound. You know, there's that huge sort of silver tarp. I'm not sure what exactly it was made of, but as the performers walked across it, I believe all the performers were in bare feet. It just sort of like it was like static, like it made so much sound. And then, you know, as the children tore pages out of the TRC and sort of glued them around the perimeter of the space and then splattered them with paint, all of those made these like incredible sounds that made the performance, I mean, really one of the most remarkable things I think I've ever seen. One of the things that happened right at the end of the show that we didn't see in that clip, but I can tell you about, is that they one of the performers approached an audience member while the show was still going on, so it was sort of a private moment, and had a microphone and asked the audience member to read some lines. I believe it was from the TRC. It might have been from a different similar report. I can't remember. But to read a bit of text into the microphone. And what I learned after is that that recording would then be used in the next performance and would be incorporated into the sound design. So you'd hear that voice from the previous audience in the next show. And you know, the technology involved in all of that wasn't very complicated. It was just a really simple, like, interview-style recorder and some, you know, astounding creativity. But I think what makes it such an amazing example of sound design is the way that they really used what and who was in the room to create the sound design. You know, we really, in performance, we really like our audiences quiet. And wow, what an amazing way to, like, sort of bust out of that paradigm in such a creative way. So I want to show one more piece. This is from the 21 Black Futures series that's on CBC Gem. It's free. All the ones I've watched are super great. They're like sort of short COVID solo performance plays and dance pieces that I'd encourage you to check out. This is a piece called Bay Air by Shantae Grant and sound design by Reza Daya. And I just want us to watch it. So what's so amazing about this piece, I think, is the way that sound design, you know, in this case, just the sound of things that are cooking in the show, is used at the beginning of the piece to sort of create this expectation for a hearing audience that we're going to have sound for the whole show, and that it's going to help us, you know, understand the story. You know, maybe we've read somewhere that this is going to be like a mostly ASL performance. And we expect to sort of have sound as a storytelling tool because, you know, everywhere we go, we have it. And then it just fades out and there's nothing. And the, you know, next 10 minutes of the show, there's nothing. It's just silence. And I think that what this does for a hearing audience and what makes this such, like, brilliant sound design, even though arguably, like, there is no sound design, it's just silence, is that it, you know, just the bit of sound at the beginning creates this expectation, and then it's taken away. And what it does for a hearing audience is it really draws our attention in. It really makes us pay attention to the ASL performance because we're not sort of having that performance, like, translated to us with sound. It compels us to look more closely. And I think that, like, this is just such an amazing example of, like, you know, creative, dramaturgically brilliant, and really, like, politicized sound design that I think is really exciting. So we've reached the end of the first part of the workshop, and let's take a quick break and maybe come back at, like, 3:20. grab some water or use the washroom or whatever. If anybody wants to like chat for a couple minutes or clarify something or just say stuff, feel free to turn your mic on and we can chat, but otherwise I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna jump back in, I think. One of the things that I think can be a little mystifying about sound design, if you're in performance, is that it's sort of not totally clear like what a sound designer actually spends their time doing, like what their tools are, you know, it's all just a little bit mysterious. So I thought that it might be useful and fun to just sort of take us through like just an example of what my process would be if I was making you a sound cue for a show you were doing. So we can sort of imagine a little fictional situation where I'm your sound designer and we have no budget. It's just me and there's no money. We want an original soundscape. We don't want any canned music. We want something made really specially for the show. And you can imagine, you know, if you mostly work in theater, sort of imagine that we have a scene that's quite a long monologue, and it takes place in a cave. And the deeper we get into the monologue, the sort of more surreal it becomes, and the more sort of strange and scary the environment gets. If you're more of like a dance or movement-minded person, you could have just imagined like a sort of very simple part of a dance where a performer is moving across a stage in sort of like a series of tableaus with sort of fluid movement in between, that they make a new tableau or pose, and then there's some more fluid movement, and then there's another tableau. You know, we've decided in our conversations as sound designer and director or choreographer that every time that we reach a beat in the monologue, or, you know, in the dance version of this example, every time we reach one of those tableaus, those sort of frozen moments, we want the sound to change somehow. We sort of want like an auditory change to go along with sort of that little bit of the dance or that bit of the monologue sort of ending and us going into the next part. Okay, but there's sort of an added layer, which is that the performances in these hypothetical scenarios are really different every single time. You know, you as a director or a choreographer, you really want the performer to be in touch with their instincts, not just sort of memorizing and repeating rhythms. So we are going to need a sound design that somehow works no matter how the show happens to go. You know, the monologue, it's emotional. The dance, it's somatic. So we need something that's going to sort of be flexible, but is also going to work every time. Okay, so tall order. Whew, we've got a whole bunch of things we're going to have to accomplish, but we could do it. So if I was your sound designer, probably where I would start, you know, if I knew that this was something we wanted to make, would be in music editing software. And I would just sort of start collecting and creating some sounds and seeing if I can sort of put something together that sort of feels like it captures the vibe and the intent that we're after. And there's a lot of different kinds of music editing software, but we have no budget, so I'm going to use a free one. I'm just going to use GarageBand, and I'm just going to use the microphone on my computer and like myself. There's not going to be any fancy instruments or musicians or technology involved. If I was on a Windows computer, I'd probably use Audacity, which is another like free open source audio editing software that any of you can get and play with if you would like to really dive deep with this stuff. Okay, so let's open our GarageBand session. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So there we go. So what we have here is just a super simple GarageBand session. I've already sort of made the different parts, and I'm going to sort of walk you through them and sort of show you how I put them together. So if you haven't used audio editing software before, there's a couple things to sort of notice. There's sort of this timeline, this sort of left to right box here that has all of our different musical chunks in it, arranged on tracks that are extremely similar to, like, if you've ever like made a trailer in iMovie, you know, you can sort of layer layers of video and different clips together and sort of blend them together in a number of different ways. Music editing software works on extremely similar principle. So let's just sort of go through these 5 tracks one at a time and just mess around with them a little bit. So let's listen to this first track, and let's just listen to it. Okay, so it's just a very simple little loop. Is pretty boring. I'm not really a singer, but it's got like a kind of like minor quality to it that I kind of like and feels like it goes with the kinds of scenes that we're working with. But let's see if we can mess around with it a bit. So there's a lot of different ways that you can, you know, on the one hand, there's like a lot of ways that sound can be transformed in the same way that, you know, lights in theater, you know, so much of lighting design is about how we're going to transform the source light, whether it's with a gel or with a gobo or with its placement or with its intensity or whatever. Sound design is a lot like that too. You know, it is really important what sounds we're using, but it's also really important how we're transforming them and sculpting them. And I feel like this piece could use some transformation. So Let's listen to this track again, and I'm gonna just affect one of the really basic ways any sound could be affected, which is its playback speed, just how fast or slow it's going. Okay, so that's normal speed. Let's go really fast. Ooh. Wow. Suddenly my vocal technique is so impressive. Just nailing that little run. Let's see what happens if I go really, really, really slow. Oh, so cool. So what happens when you slow down sound is like, oh my God, like suddenly we have this totally different sound that came out of this like literally like me lying on my back in bed with like looking at my laptop and being like, I need to make a little thing for this sound design workshop. Like we have sort of a shitty sound source that, you know, already, wow, that like became this really magical texture just by slowing it down. And I like it, but again, I feel like it needs a little bit more. Right now, it's sort of right within the range that a performer would be speaking at, because it's like the human voice, and I'm not sort of singing super high or super low. And so I feel like it's going to kind of bump into the textual performance. So I think I'm going to change the pitch. I think probably a lot of us are really familiar with what like that means, but let's just check it out. So here we are, the original pitch. I'm gonna pitch it up. Sounds like an alien baby. You know, if it wasn't a human voice, maybe pitching it up would sound cool. It's a little chipmunky. So what happens if we go down? Whoa. Yeah, okay, I like that. You know, it's nice and low. The dialogue's just going to float on top of it really, really nicely. And it's got sort of like a, it sounds sort of cave-like to me. It somehow feels like it's got that, that vibe. Okay, let's listen to the second track, again, just by itself, and see what we can do with it. Okay, so super simple loop, just me, it's just a clapping loop. And I think it sounds okay. It's nice that there's something sort of rhythmic and kind of almost like splashy about it. But to me, it kind of sounds a little like dense, like I sort of have trouble imagining other sounds fitting with it. And so I'm going to use an EQ, which is just search for equalization, a super common way of changing or affecting sound. And what an EQ does is it lets us sort of sculpt the frequencies that are happening in our sound. So let's just listen to this clap again. So what this is giving us here is a visual representation of the sound and of its frequency spectrum. So on the right-hand side here, we have the high frequencies, and depending on how high they're spiking, that's like how loud they are. And on the left-hand side, we have the low frequencies. And again, depending on how high they are, that's sort of like how much low frequency there is in the sound, which is how much high frequency there is in the sound. And then, of course, there's the middle too. Now, what's cool about EQ is it lets us sculpt the sound. So let's see what happens if we sort of hold down the highs. Let's take out a bunch of the high frequencies. It's kind of cool. It kind of sounds like kind of covered, like you threw a blanket on it. What happens if we boost the high frequencies? Wow. We really get the like chirpy bit of the sound, the really bright part of the sound. Gets really emphasized. That's kind of cool. And it almost like doesn't sound like a hand clapping anymore. Okay, let's do some stuff with the low frequencies. Let's just try cutting them right out. That's kind of nice. You know, that sort of like density that was in the sound. I feel like it's like a lighter sound now. It's not sort of quite as like bogged down. Try turning up a little. Now it sounds like we're like banging on a box or something. Like it doesn't really sound like a hand clap. There's no frequency to really boost it. But you know, when I was playing with the sound earlier, what I found was that just taking the mids way down gave me a sound I really liked. Kind of got like some highs and some lows, but like lots of space in the middle. I don't feel like it's going to conflict with other parts in the way it was before. Okay, cool. So that's some EQ, super common way of affecting sound. Let's listen to another track. This is the most boring one of all of them. It's just a regular old finger snap there. Not very exciting. And to me, when I hear that, the main thing I feel like I'm hearing is like, wow, that really is a finger snap, isn't it? That like doesn't really sound like anything else. And we know we sort of want a more abstract soundscape for our piece. So why don't we do something with it? So what I'm going to do is put an echo on it. And what's an echo sound like? It sounds like this. Hey, cool. So, you know, it's just like if you clap in the mountains or like yell hello while you're out like canoeing on a lake, the sound bouncing back at you, that's literally an echo. Sometimes this kind of effect is also called a delay. And there's just a sort of, I mean, there's like literally a million different kinds of delay, but all of them are going to have a few basic parameters. So let's just hear what those are going to sound like. So we've got time, which is sort of how long it takes between the repeats. Keep it nice and low. I want it fast. We have feedback, which is sort of, sometimes this is also called like the repeats knob. But if we turn that way down, what's that like? Okay, so like they sort of taper off really quickly. Well, if we turn it way up, we get a much longer string of repeats before it starts to fade out. Okay, that's cool. Then we've got this color knob, sometimes also called a tone knob. You'll find this on like lots and lots of different effects and sound sculpting tools. So what the color knob or tone knob does is it's basically like an EQ built into the effect that is going to just affect, in this case, the delayed signal, those extra snaps. So let's see what this sounds like. If we turn this all the way up, oh, whoa. So it's like we're just getting the high frequencies. All the low frequencies, the mid frequencies, they've been pulled out. Let's try turning it way down. That's a little low, we can't even hear it. So when we turn tone or color down, what we're doing is pulling out the high frequencies. Again, that sort of throw a blanket on it sound that happens when we take the high frequencies out of a sound. That's what's happening to the delayed signal here, which is pretty cool. I'm just going to kind of set it in the middle. I want it to sound kind of similar to the original snap. We have one more sort of set of controls, which is the dry-wet combo here, sometimes also called like a mix knob. And basically, this is just going to help us sort of balance the proportion of like the original snap versus the delayed snap. So if we turn the wet all the way down, okay, we can still hear the delay, but it's like quite quiet in the mix. It's like been turned way down. If we turn it way up, oh, super, super present. Okay, the dry knob represents that first snap, like the original signal that we're affecting. Let's try turning it all the way down. So you can actually see from the playhead here that when it crosses that snap, we don't hear it. That's because we've turned the dry signal all the way down. We're only hearing the affected that signal. I want to hear something classic. Okay, cool. So that's delay for you. Let's look at another track. I think this one's kind of embarrassing. As a vocal performance, this is really embarrassing. There's some really good singers in this workshop. So let's just, I'll just have to be humiliated. Let's just listen to it. Ooh, got a little pitchy there at the end. So again, this is just a short loop, you know, I recorded it at the same time that while I was listening to that sort of bass track we made earlier, so I know that sort of in that way it fits in. And, you know, I guess it's kind of got like kind of a scary sort of tone to it. I think that's sort of appropriate for the scene we're working on, just in terms of the melody and the performance. And, you know, I guess thinking about it, I almost do kind of like that it's not very good. You know, sometimes I think, especially with dance pieces, when they have sort of like really like perfectly composed and performed music, sometimes I'm like, you know, what are you trying to be, like the ballet? Like I thought we were over the technique thing. I thought we'd decided that was oppressive. So you know, maybe I actually don't mind it, but I still think I want to do something to it, and I want to sort of refine it a bit and do something fun with it. So I'm going to put a reverb on it. This is another, you know, effect or way of changing sound that we encounter in real life all the time. And what's that sound like? Hey, nice. Okay, I'm into that. So, you know, basically reverb's just like, you know, if you're like in a very big church or like empty arena, it's like the weird sort of reverberant sound that your voice makes. Reverb, just like delay, has a couple pretty simple controls. We've got room size, which is just going to sort of change how big this virtual room we're throwing our sound into is. We've got density or time, which is just sort of how fast that sort of splash made is going to dissipate and go away. And then again, we've got dry wet, just how much of the reverberated signal do we have versus the original signal, blah, blah, blah. Let's just hear what those, I'm just going to mess around with that and you can kind of hear. So if we turn the room size way down, it kind of sounds like maybe we're in like a tiled like bathroom, you know? It's sort of a small space. We turn it way up. Suddenly, we're in a cathedral. Density or time, let's turn that way down. Oh boy, so it just sort of goes away super fast. To silence. We turn it up. Reverb's tails sort of start to like overlap in a cool way. And again, dry wet, let's just try taking the original signal right out. All we're hearing now is the reverb. I think that sounds kind of cool. Okay, here's the real goofy one. Listen to this track. Hey, why are you messing with my friends? Kind of quiet. Let's hear that louder. Hey, why are you messing with my friends? I'm not quite sure what inspired me to record that, but we're going to try to add it in, and we're going to kind of imagine, you know, maybe this sound comes right at the end of the scene or sort of that sequence of dance movements. And you know, maybe it's a little transitional recorded text. Why not? And it's okay to me. It's kind of got like a Tom Waitsy vibe. I kind of like it, but I kind of want to push it further in that direction and just take it out of like how real the voice sounds a little bit. So I'm going to put a distortion on it. What's distortion sound like? It sounds like this. Hey, why are you messing with my friends? Yeah, much better. So distortion is kind of like, you know, again, it does sometimes occur naturally, you know, if you turn up like a speaker too loud and the speaker starts to sort of like crackle and make the sound fuzzy and gritty, that's like distortion. It's kind of like the sound of like if you're tuning a radio and you've like almost reached the right channel, but like not quite. again, that's sort of a similar tone. And distortions, again, there's a million of them, you know, especially guitarists or like distortion connoisseurs. If you have any guitarist friends, they probably have like 8 distortion pedals because they all sound different, and they do. But there's, again, a few really common controls for this. So we've got dry, which is just sort of like how intense is the effect, like how sort of hard are we pushing the gas pedal of this effect. And
Hey, why are you messing with my friends?
Kind of get like a subtle fuzziness to like that super overdriven sound we heard at the beginning.
Hey, why are you messing with my friends?
Again, we've got tone, which is this built-in EQ, and it's going to work the way the other tone knobs work, and sort of affect how much high versus low frequencies. Oh wow, we could barely hear that. It just took all the highs out. Let's turn it up a bit.
Hey, why are you messing with my friends?
Okay, so we get that covered sound from turning it down a bit. Let's turn it all the way up.
Hey, why are you messing with my friends?
And many distortions will also have some sort of like dry-wet or mixed combo that just sort of affects how much of the effect is being used. So this sounds cool. I want to hear them all together. Let's see what sort of soundscape we've made.
Hey, why are you messing with my friends? Hey, why are you...
Okay, yeah, I could see that. You know, we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a lot of money. I can see it working. We're gonna make it work. You know, before we sort of go to the next part of the workshop and talk about Qlab, I just sort of want to say, you know, the different ways of like transforming sound that we just looked at, like delay, distortion, reverb, changing pitch, changing time, changing the EQ of a sound. Those are like, you know, really the most common ways of affecting a sound that your sound designer is going to be using. And if you sort of have a sense of what some of the language around those tools is, it can let you give more specific notes and directions and have a more specific conversation with your sound designer about what they're making. You know, basically all effects or ways of transforming sounds are just variations on this. It's like hot rodding a car, you know, at least from what I gathered. Like, you know, it's like every car has a muffler, but like some of them have, but there's like a lot of different mufflers you could put on your car because they all sound different. But they're all mufflers. Delays, reverbs, pitch shifting effects, all of this is just like that. I do want to say, though, that while these are sort of the most common effects you'll run into and the ones that are used the most, there are others as well, and that are sort of more esoteric and strange, and you know, what kind of effects and ways of manipulating sound your sound designer has access to is going to really depend on the person. So get curious, talk to them, ask them what they're thinking. You know, you can be like, hey, sound designer, like, I like what you're making, but I just feel like it needs to be radically transformed somehow. And maybe they, in their bag of tricks, have some way of doing that you might never have thought of or known about. Again, GarageBand, Audacity, they're free, depending on which kind of computer you have. I'd encourage you, if you wanted to sort of dive way deeper with all of this on your own. There's some really special stuff you can do. Okay, thank you very much, GarageBand. We appreciate you. So we're now going to switch to Qlab, which is something I imagine lots of folks have some familiarity with. Qlab sort of addresses this, is sort of the industry standard way of addressing this kind of unique dynamic of live performance, which is that, you know, it's different every time. If we were making a movie, you know, we could use all the sound design tools we just looked at, and then we could sort of take our sound files and like very carefully line them up with the print of the you know, the latest draft of the film. And we might get a new draft of the film, but that's okay. We can just move things around again. We can make things really precise. But with performance, it's almost always going to be a little different each time. And as I said before, especially with this performance, because of how you've directed it, choreographed it, it's going to be really different each time. So Qlab is going to kind of be where we go to sort of figure out the next part of our sound cue. It's really the industry standard. You can control lights and video from it too, and do other cool things as well, which is pretty amazing. But we're just going to look at the sound stuff. If you're new to Qlab, it's also free. If you have a Mac, it's not Windows compliant. I have no idea why, but it's not. It's free, and we don't have the money to sort of upgrade to the fancy features that it can use. So we're just going to use the free features. So if you're new to Qlab, what we have here is sort of like a series of little buttons and actions along the top here, little symbols. Those each represent like an action that Qlab can do. And really, there's only 2 actions you need to worry about if you're working with sound. Like really, there's the sound file action, which just sort of indicates play a sound file, play a song, play some file, I assign to this. And then there's the fade cue, which is sort of exactly like in lighting. How lighting designers are always like, let's put a count of 10 on that. Can I hear that at 80% or whatever? Sort of like talking about like how bright the light is, how long it's going to take to fade in and fade out. We can do the exact same things with sound, adjust, how loud they are and how long it's going to take to fade up to that max volume or fade down to nothing. So we've got these 2 cues, and basically the way Qlab works is every time I press go here, boop, it's going to sort of perform the action that was selected, like that one, go, and then go down to the next action in the list. And sort of be ready and waiting for whenever that action needs to be performed, and then I press go, and it happens. So it's sort of like it's almost like you're making a list, and then you're sort of like checking it off one at a time. A list of actions that you need to have performed. So let's turn the sounds that we made in GarageBand into a little sound design. And so what I've done is I've taken each of those little tracks we made, and I've exported them each on their own so that we have them each sort of independently, just like how we made them and listened to them in GarageBand. So I'm going to select those 5 tracks. I'm going to pop them in here. Okay, great. This looks awesome. So we have our 5 different files, and I'm just going to link them all together so that they're all going to play back at the same time. So when I press go, they're all going to play at once. And what else do I want to do? I want to loop them all, just like in GarageBand, so we just hear them on a loop because, we don't know exactly how long the different parts of this dance or monologue underscoring we're working on are going to take. So we got to sort of keep it loose, make sure that the files are going to play long enough that they don't run out. So let's hear what that sounds like. Everything all together. Okay, there it is. Yes, we know. Why are they messing with their friends? So this sounds fine, but we talked about how every time that we reach a new tableau in the dance or a new beat in the monologue, we want the sound to change somehow. So why don't we sort of play these back one at a time? So I'm going to still have them all start playing at the same time, but on these 4 tracks, I'm going to turn the volume down to 0. Did that do that? Yes, it did. Okay, so now we're just going to hear the first track. Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that. So, you know, we could tell the stage manager when we reach this beat or when we reach this pose, we're going to go for, you know, the first sound cue. Sounds pretty good to me. The one thing I don't like about it right now, sort of from an artistic vantage point, is that it just sounds a little like, just sort of comes in kind of abruptly. I think it should sort of creep up on us in a sort of more subtle way. So I'm going to use the fade cue. So I'm going to pop a fade cue in. And I'm going to assign it to that first track. I'm going to go to the first track. I'm going to turn the volume all the way down. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say, yes, we'd want the volume faded up. Yeah, let's just go back to 0. Okay, great. And I want to say that that's going to fade up over 5 seconds. Okay, cool. Okay, what would that sound like? Let's see what it sounds like. Okay, nice. I'm liking that. So now we have these other tracks, and they're each going to sort of come in on a different beat or tableau that happens in the performance. So let's pick an order. I don't love this order. I do want the hey track to be loud. Yeah, let's go bass, then the clapping drums, then the highs. No, I want the clapping drums after the finger snap. Yeah, okay, this seems like it'll be a nice order. We're sort of getting more rhythmic as we go. So why don't we put in some fade cues for each of those next tracks? Pop some in there. So after we hear that bass fade in, the next thing that's going to happen is that we're going to fade in this, this high singing bit. And I want that to come in real slow, so I'm going to say like 10 seconds. Great. And then let's fade in the finger snap. Why beat about the bush? It can come in 3 seconds. Doesn't matter. It can come in fast. The finger snap, 7 seconds. Okay, I like that. Let's just hear what that's going to sound like. We're going to sort of slowly layer up this sound cue. Okay, monologue, 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 dance, 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 tableau, beat, and go. Ooh. That faded in really nicely. I like that. It might be a little slow on the fade. It might be nice to hear it a little quicker, but let's leave it for now. And let's bring in the finger snap. Oh, I like that, but it's kind of loud. Let's turn it down a bit. Okay, so we've just sort of built up this soundscape that no matter how the performance goes on a given night, you know, however long it takes to reach the next tableau, however long it takes to reach the next beat of the monologue, the sound is kind of essentially going to be the same. That's pretty cool. Let's do one last fun thing, which is bring in the hey, what are you doing with my friends thing. And I want this to just jump in. So I'm going to set a fade time of 0. It's just going to pop in. But at the same time, I want to fade out all the other layers. So I'm going to put in a bunch more fade cues. I'm going to link them all together so that all of these actions are going to be performed at the same time. And we'll just assign all those. Great. We'll just make sure that what this is going to do is fade these right out. And I think it should sort of fade out slowly. So let's set the fade out time for these to 15 seconds. Okay, now let's build up our soundscape and then build it, sort of take it down. Oh, and let's put one cue right at the end that's going to stop the hey, what are you doing with my friends cue. Okay, here we go. Rock and roll, I like it. Okay, some more monologues, some more movement, and we get our next layer. Oh, whoa, they went so fast that time. We're already at the next layer. No problem. We programmed this in Qlab. Okay, we've got that subtle finger snap there. Whoa, there it is already. And then let's fade out those other layers. Still so loud. Oh, and it's all done. Whoa, great. So that was exciting. You know, I wanted to just sort of share this because I think if you sort of have a sense of like what tools a sound designer is using, ways that they can be programming sound, it can give you a lot of insight into like sort of what kind of things you can add, what things are going to be easy, what things are going to be difficult. Where'd you all go? Oh no! So sorry about that. I think I must have disappeared for a second. Yeah, that's just sort of an example of like a super simple sound cue that I might make and the way I might make it. Like I said, if you sort of start to understand what these tools are that your sound designer is using, it can really give you a sense of like what's possible. So for instance, there you saw it was super easy for us to rearrange different layers, to put them in different orders, to change how long it took to have different layers fade in and fade out, to have sort of this flexible structure where, it sort of is following the performer instead of the performer having to follow it. But there are other things that would definitely be harder to do in Qlab. Like we can't really create or sculpt sound in the same way. That's more of kind of like an earlier in the process sound design task that we would need to do in our music editing software. So if you're deep into tech, it's probably not going to be a great time to ask for like a bunch of new material, but it's going to be a great time to alter the material that you already have and find new ways of using it. If you're early in the design process, you're making new sounds, it's not necessarily the greatest time to start nitpicking like exactly how loud every cue is. Like, save it for tech. Really focus on what sounds you're creating and the ways you're shaping them and how they're interacting with the performance. Again, all of this is free, so feel free to dig deep, and the odds are actually decent. You'll discover you don't need a sound designer as often as you think you do. You can just do it yourself. So we've reached 4. I have like about maybe 5 more minutes of things to say, and then would be super happy to hang out and chat with people if people want to. But I know we've sort of hit 4, and we've really sort of covered the heart of the workshop. So if you need to get going or dip out or whatever, please do what you need to. So I just wanted to say a couple things about collaborating with sound designers and some things that are kind of unique about it. One of the things that's unique about sound design is that compared to other design disciplines, it can be present really, really early in the process. Lighting design, we need a bunch of lights and like probably a theater, and set design, we need to build all those sets. That's going to take a lot of time. But with sound design, all you really need is a playback device, like a laptop, and like a little speaker, so everyone can hear what's going on. And this lets sound design be present really, really early in the process. Through the creation process, performers can start working with sound really early. And even in a really, really short, compressed, contemporary rehearsal process that so many of us end up dealing with pretty often, you can work in this sort of really collaborative and kind of like experimental, organic way. There's this sort of also just means a couple of things in my experience, one of which is that because sound is present early, it can be really tempting if like a scene isn't working or just like a dance bit isn't coming together to be like, could we make some sound for that? And very often, I think that's like not the answer. The answer is in the performance, in the direction, in the choreography that just maybe hasn't quite gotten there yet, and just needs a little bit more time. And it might be good to sort of hold back on the instinct to be like, well, we have a sound designer here, so maybe they could make something that would like make it better. The other thing that working with sound designers in rehearsal means is that they're going to be probably spending a lot of extra time on the project because they're going to be in rehearsal sort of, taking everything in and then also like going home and making new things to bring in and try and sort of doing the hard work of sound design at other times. And so I think it's sort of good to chat with your sound designer early on about sort of what both of your expectations are in terms of how much time they're going to be spending in the space. Like I'm someone who really wants to spend a lot of time in the rehearsal hall. Some sound designers less so. It's just good to sort of communicate about those expectations early on. And if your sound designer is going to be in the space a lot, consider if sort of recognizing that in the fee is something that you can do and would be appropriate. Just because they are going to end up spending a bunch of extra time on it. Yeah, it's just kind of different than, like a lighting designer who can kind of like very often come in right at the end of the process for a couple of rehearsals and then have an intense tech week. I think it's important to like respect your sound designer's boundaries around things like time and how much time they're going to be in the space. Come up with creative ways you can get them in the space without them having to be there, like zoom them in, get them to send you sound cues that the stage manager can play back, and then you can send them notes, just so that they aren't, commuting to the theater for, just for a couple hours to test some sound cues. And this thing about boundaries kind of brings me to just what I want to close with, and kind of the question I want to leave you with, which is like, as a director or a choreographer, how do you view your designers? Do you view them as the sort of people who could have boundaries? Do you view them as little robot children making you beep boops? How do you think about your designers, and what role do they play in the creative process? And I think this question of like how sound designers are viewed by and interacted with by choreographers and directors goes really deep. Like it really affects whether sound designers feel like they can speak to things they see happening, in the rehearsal room or in the text of the performance, things that based on their lived experience they might see that people in the room might not. Similarly, processes that have really focused on like the well-being of, mostly performers, like safer spaces policies and this kind of thing, like to what degree is that extended to, and like really sort of like meaningfully invited designers to like participate in those processes as well. Designers, like we've had so many conversations about like harm in performance spaces that I feel like have largely focused on like actors and their relationships with directors and with each other. And we kind of haven't started to talk about some of the unique things that can happen for a designer. One of the things that happens with a designer, of course, is that we're often working in really one-on-one situations with directors and choreographers. We're having, meetings with just them. We're sort of, we don't always have sort of like a witness for what's happening in the spaces we inhabit. And I think that can lead to like really unique kinds of harm and negative experiences that, we have to address somehow. And I think how a director or choreographer views their team of designers is really going to affect that. I do want to say that, like, while I think I will always be like an advocate for a process that creates time and space for like everyone involved to like be fully involved, beyond just like whatever their sort of special skill is that they're bringing to the process. Realistically, sometimes there's not time for that. Sometimes those processes can also be like very self-indulgent and frustrating to work inside of. So, sometimes you actually do just need someone to make you some sounds. And I think that's totally okay. But I also think it's really, really important to communicate those expectations really, really clearly. Like, if I'm hired for a show where I think I'm just sort of, there to make some sounds, and then the director sort of starts asking me for like a lot of like, maybe like information about like the one trans character in the play, and how should they approach directing that and whatever. Like, I wasn't hired to do that. That's like an extra job, and we only have 3 weeks, and I have to make you a sound design. If you wanted to do that, we need more time, and we would have needed to have a conversation about that earlier on. So I think, all ways of working with and communicating with and relating to a sound designer or any of your designers can work. I think it's just good to be upfront and to sort of know thyself when it comes to this, and sort of reflect on what kind of space you want to make and can make with the time and resources that you have available to you. And the last thing I want to say is just, we've been talking a lot in the performing arts industry about sort of who can and should tell which stories and how, and sort of what's the ethics of that, and what's appropriate and what isn't, and what's like appropriative and what isn't. And I don't think we've really sort of extended that conversation to designers and crew members yet. There's still a sort of attitude a lot of the time that it's like, we'll hire who's available and who can kind of like technically accomplish the task we need. But we're not sort of, I feel like, as an industry asking like, what else is this person bringing to a project? What sort of lived experiences are they bringing to it? What, how's their identity and experience of the world going to affect their experience of working on this show, and our experience of working together, and ultimately the art that we're going to make together. Yeah, I just sort of want to leave you with this question of like, when you're working with sound designers, there's a lot of things to think about, including like, what skills do they need? But I just encourage you to sort of think beyond that, and sort of ask yourself, what is this person going to bring to this project beyond their skill set, and how is that going to affect everyone's experience on this project? So I think I'll leave the talky portion there. Thank you everyone for being so nice, and for the people who left their cameras on for smiling at my little jokes. I really appreciated that. And I realized I forgot to thank some people earlier too. Deanna Choi, who was a sound design mentor of mine and taught me a lot about sound design recently, really informed this workshop. Kieslina Patterson, who basically like directed and dramaturged this workshop and told me how to make it good, because it wasn't in the first draft. And Krista Jackson, who offered for us to use her ProZoom account, and then we ended up using Sick and Twisted's ProZoom account, so thank you Sick and Twisted. For convoluted reasons, we had to make that switch, and thank you to Ali Robson, who brought me some really delicious snacks earlier today. I think because she knows that snacks are very, very important to my creative process. So, and thank you, of course, to all of you for coming out today.